Thank you for your patience. It's a pleasure to be here today and to be participating in the session on advancing our food compositional data set. Before I introduce Dr. Maya Vilonek and Dr. Stark-Reed, I've been asked to set the context for today's presentation by spending a few moments talking about factors that influence the food compositional data sets. Oh, no disclaimer slide. Beautiful. I was supposed to have a disclaimer slide. Sorry, Maya, I know you were planning on using the same one. I have no direct benefit from my relationships with the food industry. However, I am a federal government employee, and as a result of that, I am obligated to follow the federal policy on values and ethics. However, having said that, I have no disclaimer. I also have a lot of biases that I've accumulated over my career that started in public health, worked with the food processing industry, worked in the nonprofit sector before I landed in government. And I think it's really important that we don't lose track of the fact that there are lots of different ways that we can position our information. So what I want to start by saying is that the food composition data is the basis for many of our decisions about food and nutrition policy. And if we don't have good compositional data, then we run the risk of making really poor decisions. And I think that's really fundamental for the discussion today, that as we move forward with some of these really interesting innovations that we heard about today, they're only going to be as accurate as the data that's underpinning them. So don't lose track of that. And for those researchers who have accumulated their own food compositional data sets and they're using them back at their labs, it's really important that you do updates and validate whether or not they are reflective of the retail market base. Because one of the key messages that I want to leave with you today is that the food compositional set is not static. So there's been a lot of discussion over the last year, especially as we entertain a front-of-pack labeling policy about which is the best labeling system. And my point is none of them are, because it all depends on the algorithm and the data that's being used to create them. And so this is an area where I think we sometimes forget that some of the fundamental information that we're using may not be as up-to-date as we would like it to be. And you're going to learn more about how we can enhance our data and how we can improve the different types of systems that we have in place. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about each of these four themes: why the food supply is not static, why we need to keep an eye on where it's going, where it's been, and how important it is to not only move forward as these food products start to change, but also keep good historical records of where the food supply has been so that we can do appropriate comparisons over time periods. So I'm sure each one of you could have come up with a list very similar to this one as to factors that influence why nutrient values of different foods are changing over time. We only have to walk down the street towards the falls to realize that this year, the daffodils aren't even at their peak. I mean, it's unheard of. Niagara Falls in May is one big garden, and here we are waiting for the tulips to start to bloom. But we've also got issues regionally. Canada is a really big country. Right now, the east is flooded and the west is still getting snow. That's going to have a significant impact as to when farmers could get on the field, how long the growing season is going to be, how well developed these foods are going to be, and as a result, food supply this year is going to have a different nutrient compositional characteristic than some of the food values that we've had in previous years. So we can't lose sight of that. We also know that animal and plant breeding technology has changed over time for well-meaning reasons, and sometimes the nutritional value has shifted partly because it hasn't been front and center of those breeding programs, but because of the impact of breeding programs, we've also had some major benefits. And then food processing, be it good, bad, or neutral, it does have an impact depending upon the ingredients that we're adding to the food supply, whether or not we're using new innovative high-pressure processing technology or ultralight to advance the nutrient profile of some of our food products. And of course, food storage is going to be a factor. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the natural changes that have happened. I used to work for the Egg Marketing Agency. I'm very happy. It was one of the more creative jobs I've had. And I was there over 15 years ago when we had a project with Health Canada looking at the cholesterol content of an egg. At the time when we started the project, eggs were villainized as being the major reason why heart disease was increasing in North America. And the cholesterol content was about 380 milligrams in an average egg. Well, because of changes in breed of laying head and more consistent and enhanced diet, grain, we're not talking anything major here, but just better grain, the cholesterol content in the eggs dropped to less than 200 milligrams. That's a significant change in the food supply, and we need to recognize that that's happening not only in something as simple as an egg, but in other meats when we've started to shift and be more consistent with the nutrient intake that we're giving the animals, as well as what we're doing in plant breeding. I've just read a really interesting article about high-protein rice. When you think of how important rice is for a large part of the world, and we're able to shift the protein content from 6 to 10 micrograms, we're able to find rice or use rice as a protein alternative and blend it to improve the nutritional composition of diets. Not only that, with our improved food processing technology, we're able to create gluten-free products using a high-protein grain. So these are very subtle but real changes that are happening right now that are going to influence the nutrient composition of our food supply. So when you go to look up in our tables what the nutrient composition is of rice, you need to be talking about which rice product and which rice has been blended into some of our food products. Same way that we're moving forward with pulses, and a lot of pulse flour is being incorporated into our food products. These are going to have dramatic shifts in the food composition profile. And the obvious one, I don't think I need to tell people in this room about fortification policy, but right now we have mandatory fortification, milk and margarine for vitamin D, but we're also seeing products with voluntary fortification like orange juice with vitamin D and calcium. And we're going to see a whole bunch of new products that are gently moving forward from the natural health products rules to the food side that have a variety of different supplementation levels. So understanding the policies and the natural factors that are influencing our food supply is really critical in order to make our food choices or our food policy decisions wisely. It's not just the farmer or the food manufacturer who are driving some of these changes. There's a lot of consumer interest in finding foods that meet either their health and well-being values or their personal choice values. And we've had a lot of emphasis on trying to lower the sodium content of foods, replacing trans fats with alternative fats, pushing more whole grain products, finding alternative sweeteners. So if you've been able to shift your food composition to reflect these values, then it's going to be really important that our tools for nutrition assessment and our apps are also making the adjustment as well. And from where I sit in my position in agriculture, we're not just focused on nutrition. My team is focused on a lot of consumer choice issues. And this is where I firmly believe if we're going to invest in some of our food nutrient composition data sets, we invest in a platform that's scalable and that it's going to be able to capture some of the personal choice values. We know that the United States has just introduced mandatory disclosure labeling for biotechnology foods. Nearly said the wrong word there, not very good. We've got a lot of work going on in organics. We've got interest in halal. So as we expand our ability to contain data, I think it's really important that we look at not just nutrition, but some of these other factors that are influencing the food supply. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on sodium reduction and give you a few examples of each of these categories. So I'll start with sodium reduction. And, you know, it's a sore point for me has sodium reduction decreased enough, not enough? Is it glass half full, half empty? Doesn't really matter, because in the context of today's discussion, What we need to recognize is that our nutrition labeling on food labels allows for variation. And sometimes there are changes in the food supply that are made very gradually and subtly that don't necessarily require a change in the food product label itself. And so while we're working within the ranges on a food label, over time and multiplied by all of the various foods available, that can have a significant impact on our assessment about food intake patterns. So again, it's just a cautionary note that the food supply is always changing to accommodate new ingredients and to accommodate new desires. Sodium was one that has a huge impact on taste. Consumers don't like their products to change if they're used to a different taste. So industry in this case was looking for a very gradual reduction that didn't have a big impact on taste profile. And the same thing is happening both with fat and with sugar as well. There's also a huge number of products in our grocery store. The average grocery store has over 40,000 products in it. So how on earth, as nutritionists, are we going to keep track of all of these different foods? We need to make sure that we've got tools in place that will help us do that. According to the March 2019 Mintel database, just using the bread category as an example, and I use bread because it's been identified as a major contributor to sodium in the food supply, there were 186 new bread products launched in Canada last year, more than double that number in the US. Some for health reasons, like whole grain, gluten-free, sodium reduction, but some for other reasons as well. So we've got different data sets that are capturing this. We want to learn to marry the data and make sure that as we look at our nutrition profile, some of these new product launches are captured in, or at least we ask questions about what the new product captures are. There's also country-specific formulations. I don't think anyone's too surprised to know that different countries have different policies about fortification, about ingredients, about approved food processing technique. So if we have more food coming from different places outside the country, even though they are supposed to conform to Canada's food labeling rules and food approvals, it's not always the case. And when we're comparing data from country to country, we need to make appropriate adjustments so that we are reflecting the policies and the food supply in those countries. I'm not promoting Wonder Bread, but it happens to be one of the few products that is marketed both in Canada and in the United States. If we use Wonder Bread as an example of a product that is crossing the border or could be used in our nutrient assessment tools, the data for a Canadian product is very different than the data for an American product, which is also different than the data that's currently in the Canadian nutrient file. So these subtle differences multiplied by a bunch of products are going to have an impact on our nutrient intake data. The same thing goes with breakfast cereals, particularly because the fortification policy in the US is very different than the fortification policy in Canada. So we need to have a strong appreciation for the subtleties in where and how nutrient profiles can shift over time and with different policy implications. Oh, what did I do? Help. Okay, hang on, there's another button, I'm sure, somewhere. Oh, no, I don't think I'm done. Maybe I'm done. Okay, I'm done. Good. So the underlying message here, I should be done. The underlying message here is that the food supply is always changing. We need to understand why it's changing. We need to take into consideration how this influences our decisions and our policies and our comparisons when we're looking at different studies done in different countries, done in different places. So my job is now to introduce Dr. Stark Reed from the United States Department of Agriculture. She's the Deputy Administrator for the Nutrition, Food Safety, and Product Quality New Uses Program within the Agricultural Research Service. She also serves as the Ethic Counselor, Officer and Scientific Integrity Officer for ARS. Dr. Stark-Reed is well known throughout the human nutrition community for her efforts at NIH to link nutrition science research with research on physical activity to help better understand how the quality of diet and physical activity contribute to health and obesity. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Reed.